You're listening to The Alchemist Ring, audiobook performed by me, author Jason Lee Willis. Part 5, A Kingdom of Unhewn Stone. Chapter 78, Bermuda, 1707. Of all the islands in the Caribbean, the island of Bermuda is the northernmost and is located 600 miles off the coast of North Carolina. Bermuda forms the top of the triangle that spans between the tip of Florida and Puerto Rico. The British Empire established a colony in 1612, which began developing agriculture before quickly shifting the economy to whaling, shipbuilding, and privateering. Its unique hook shape made it an excellent harbor for ships crossing the Atlantic. 6 years earlier, 2 French ships departed Bermuda for La Rochelle. One of the ships, guarded by Pierre-Charles Le Sueur, abruptly burst into flames, taking its precious cargo down to the depths. Now, Captain Edward Drummond anchored near the place where the ship was lost. If I find the Philosopher's Stone, I win. A ship approaches, Captain. Edward Drummond abandoned his spot at the railing of the ship, looked at the crow's nest, and then found the line of sight for the approaching ship. Spanish. Quartermaster to arms! The ship came alive after hours of hushed silence, and Drummond rushed up the stairs to the quarterdeck for a better view. The ship came out of the Great Sound, a protected harbor almost 90% enclosed by a thin arm that wrapped around from the main part of the Bermuda Island. The Phoenix, Drummond's stolen warship, was anchored almost 15 nautical miles from the mouth of the harbor, between the outer edge of the reef and the Bermuda Rise, where the ocean floor met the island. She's small and alone, Drummond said to himself more than his crew. Master Gunner, load the cannons and stand down. I want to hear what they want. Sir? His anchoring boatswain called out from the edge of the ship where divers were submerged. As is, Drummond ordered. The time, sir. Drummond pulled out his watch. The diving bell had been under for 36 minutes already. Damn it. Let them stay, but if the time expires, be discreet about it. He found his looking glass and studied the approaching ship. It was a small vessel, armed with just a few cannons. A patrol boat, more bark than bite. Perhaps I should snarl a bit. Show 'em our teeth! A shout went out from the crew, and just the order raised the bloodlust. The white skull on the black flag had attacked enough ships for rumor to circulate the Caribbean Sea. Surprisingly, the ship did not change direction, but a white flag climbed up the pole to join the Spanish. What do these fools want? As the Spanish ship came into range of the guns, Drummond heard the diving bell release air behind him, but knew the hull of the Phoenix blocked the view of their activities. State your business in Bermuda, the Spanish captain called out. I am Edward Thatcher of the Phoenix, he partially lied. We are wanted fugitives by the British government and seek safe harbor. We anchored off the coast of your island so not to raise any alarm and to show our good faith. We'd heard that the French and Spanish had taken the island away from England last year, but wanted confirmation lest we fall into a trap. The Spaniard nodded. The rumors are true. Spain now controls Bermuda. I am Captain Hernandez, Harbor Patrol, but for the safety of our people, we will deny your entrance into the harbor. My ship is in desperate need of supplies. Another lie, but I'll play along. Until our defenses can be rebuilt, the port is closed, especially to English ships, whose loyalty are often doubtful. Another English fugitive told a similar story, and when we allowed him into port, he raised El Miembro, attacked the port, and killed a dozen residents before he was driven off. El Miembro? Drummond kept a serious expression, but reveled at the thought of a penis upon a flag. Does Patrick Dalzia live after all these years? He'd be a valuable ally in the Gulf. I understand your reticence, but know that I have Catholic allies. I have letters from the Lemoyne family, including the governor of Mobile Colony. If that helps, I can send. I'm only enforcing the policy chosen by the administration of the island, Hernandez interrupted. But we will gladly supply any requisitions in exchange for your compliance. They are begging to be pirated. Alas, I have no time. My interest is beneath the waters. We have no interest in attacking your island, so I accept the terms you offer, and I will send my provisions bosun to supervise these requisitions. If we are properly outfitted, we will depart peacefully from your island within 3 days. A deal was struck, and his provisions bosun quickly loaded into a skiff. No sooner had it departed than Drummond rushed to the side of the ship. He looked over the railing to see his crew of Greek divers staring up at him from beside the suspended metal bell. So? Drummond asked. It's a French vessel with damage from a fire. Another 100 yards and it would have been much too deep to reach. But you can reach it, right? Oh yes, we've already begun exploring the ship. We'll have to clear away some of the old rigging to move the bell into position, but she's not as deep as you'd imagine. Drummond looked back to the Spanish ship and the island of Bermuda. The location was close enough to shore to be witnessed and rescued, yet far enough from shore to sink it in the depths of the Atlantic. The sewer wanted it to be seen. Witnesses confirmed his account of the disaster. Drummond felt reinvigorated and pounded his fist on the railing. How much time do you need? It'll take us a day to remove the rigging, but once we do that, we'll be able to scour that wreck from nose to stern. The explosion had caused the ship to sink quickly, according to the reports that Pierre Charles barely had enough time to free his prisoners, let alone obtain the treasure securely locked away in the hold. I would have saved the stone. Too suspicious to believe, unless he wanted to be rid of it. Drummond called to his navigator. I want you to create a chart marking a triangle-shaped grid from this point back to the island. A map of the seafloor. A few years earlier, Pierre Charles Lesueur had reported the disaster to King Louis and Farmer General Alexander Lahoulier, an alchemist who served the Order of Eos. After reviewing the court records and the accounts from the Lemoyne family, Drummond now understood how Eos had been duped by a monster of a man who was capable of ripping up trees with his bare hands and whose feet were so large they created lakes where he stepped. Like the giant I faced in Madagascar. If Pierre Charles Lesueur did not die in Cuba, then what truly happened to the Philosopher's Stone? Chapter 79, The Dalek Islands, 1708. The Sublime Ottoman State, as it called itself, was founded at the end of the 13th century in modern-day Turkey. After crossing into Europe in 1354 and parts of Africa shortly after, it became a global power on 3 continents. During the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from the capital of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith with 32 provinces and numerous vassal states. With its powerful military, flexible economy, and strategic intercontinental location, the Ottoman Empire ruled in relative stability in the region, despite conflict along the Habsburg and Russian frontiers. Because of its presence in the Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, Persian Gulf, and Red Sea, European empires developed trade routes around Africa to avoid Ottoman control. Like its powerful neighbor, the Mughal Empire, it also supported the religion of Sunni Islam, with its northern arm reaching as far as Kiev and its western arm reaching as far as Algiers. Its southern reach grasped the Red Sea all the way to the Horn of Africa. Possessing mostly coastal lands, it had vital ports such as Jeddah, Suakin, Adulis, and Massawa. 30 nautical miles from the port of Massawa, the White Zombie anchored in the the shallow waters of Dalek Islands. Surrounded by 123 other islands and a bay whose mouth was hidden from view by smaller islands, the White Zombie allowed trade vessels to cruise by at a distance without being seen. Captain Garin and Master Gunner Horn took one of the skiffs to first scout the area and then scout the port, leaving Pierre Charles Lesueur trapped on an island with the overly inquisitive Josiah Farrow. Just like freshly washed white linen, Lesueur's flesh and hair had returned to normal, but still unusual condition. Farrow couldn't let it go. As Papa Bones prepared breakfast for the men sleeping on the soft sands of the warm island, Farrow came up with a plate of freshly cooked eggs and offered it to Lesueur. Accepting meant he'd be stuck answering questions all morning. "Strange word, wish we," Farrow began. "You say it's a Sioux word?" Winona used it. He nodded. "Any Sioux words similar to it?" Lesueur sighed and nodded. Wishopi is their word for star. Oh, Farrow got to the connection quickly. "The comet of 1682, the one the natives believe summoned a hero to fight the shape-shifting monster in the cave. Wishopi, fascinating." Farrow took a moment to eat his eggs. "The cook is an eccentric fellow, too. He believes you've been marked. He thinks he could see a glow about you even before the meltdown at the island. So, why do you think you were spared by the vaporous cloud that destroyed so much of the island?" Farrow transitioned from his question to his food in a blink of an eye. Lesueur had idolized Father Marquette's Jesuit oath, yet Lesueur had murdered men in war and peace. He tried to remain chaste, yet gave himself to Winona out on the frontier and then refused to name her as wife. Even worse, he replaced her in his bed with Marguerite Messier, who ended up being his Delilah. He, like Samson, chose to live with his enemies. To survive, Lesueur had made pacts with two enemies, Eos and the Priory. "It obviously has nothing to do with my moral quality." So like the sinful Israelites standing beneath Mount Sinai while Moses was made pure by the fires of God, Farrow said while scooping up each little bit of egg from his plate. "The Philosopher's Stone lore tells how Nicholas Flamel managed to replicate the original in a way that prolonged the lives of his wife and him. I've been reflecting on that theory, but according to your anecdotes, both the Philosopher's Stone and the Shamir felt unholy?" "When we unearthed the Philosopher's Stone," Lesueur began telling the story that had unfolded several years earlier, "my colleague reached for the stone, and the flesh from his hands sloughed off as he'd grabbed a white, hot coal. Another time, Kiaksa, a warrior of renown amongst the Sioux, had the stone slip right through his hands, which were left burned and bloody." "Yet the stone recognized you. That is curious." Farrow set down his plate, rolled up his sleeves, and gave his undivided attention to Lesueur, who self-consciously looked down. "Louis Armand held a theory that the Philosopher's Stone had somehow imbued you with magic. Imbued means that—" "I know what imbued means," Lesueur snapped. "Remember who purchased so many of your books on alchemy." "Yes, but you didn't purchase my whole library, did you?" Farrow retorted playfully. "I had a collection of alternative versions of Genesis, one of which even came from the ancient land of Sheba. That account gave a fuller description of Eden, which included a lake that translates as crystal. Although it sounds a little fanciful, anyone who bathed in the waters of Crystal Lake found themselves purified both physically and spiritually, washed white." "You think that's what happened to me?" "Oh, no. I dismiss Louis Armand's imbued theory since you obviously held the ability to hold it prior to holding it. See, plus there was no physical change to your two states of being, Pharaoh chuckled at his own phrasing. He mocks me for being a killer. So, what is your theory about what happened? Pharaoh took a moment while his head bobbed to a tune. Wutak. I never should have told him that part. I was delirious from loss of blood. Wutak? Take the biblical figure of Abraham as a comparison. He was a Babylonian warrior before he settled in the Promised Land to raise his flocks. Yet when God looked out upon humanity, he chose Abram, and then placed his seal of approval upon him, and for generations afterwards, anyone who held the mark received the glory of God. Generations of Jews received God's glory because of their connection to Abram. The shadowy figure that stood between you and the blast, it called you child of Wutak, didn't it? Yes, but I don't know what that means. If I were to venture a guess, I would say it was an angel that stood in front of you, and with the immortal nature of angels, it likely recognized you like Abraham's descendants were recognized in the Bible. That crazy Haitian chef might be right about Chojab. Both relics, the Philosopher's Stone and the Shamir, were crafted with evil spirits that can harm mere mortals. But you, child of Wutak, there is something special in your blood that makes you different. Lesueur scoffed. His aristocratic blood resulted in him being shipped away from France, since his older brother would inherit all the property. Perhaps I'm descended from the Alchemist. King Solomon? Lesueur shook his head. I jest. But no, I was referring to the original alchemist, the one who crafted the Philosopher's Stone, as we call it. If the stone is real, then he is also real. Solomon went looking for him. Eos searches for him. And now, Louis Armand Guerin searches the earth for clues about him. While I understand the periphery serves as wardens for humanity, what if our efforts to thwart Eos leads to something worse? Worse? Pharaoh asked. Guerin has referenced the stone as a key. Right now, we search for the ring to command the Shamir. But for what purpose? To act as a key. I have sinned enough in my life. I'm already responsible for unearthing one holy relic. I don't want to be responsible for unlocking something worse. Pharaoh pondered quietly for a few moments. In the distance, the camp began to stir, drawing his attention away. Then suddenly, his eyes widened. The key to the bottomless pit. Is that what concerns you? Lesueur nodded about the prophecy about the end times. We know what Eos believes about buried gods. The Book of Revelation describes a key that is used to unlock Apollyon the Destroyer, Pharaoh finished. That is a disturbing thought. The words were swallowed up by the excitement in the distance, and even Lesueur's concentration was broken by the sight of his master gunner and captain walking into camp. The whirlwind has returned to us. Pharaoh took the plate and cup and scurried back to join the others. Lesueur methodically began to pack his tent and belongings. No sooner had he finished than Guerin himself walked up. Let me guess. You found the ring, it's in your pocket, and now we can depart for America. Guerin felt into his pocket, found it empty, and shrugged. No such luck. We'll be departing soon. We're going to be leaving the ship here with Naufragio and Del Toro. Seabird eggs, turtles, and food from the mangroves will sustain the crew, and we'll leave them with a rowboat just in case they need to supplement the supplies. The African mainland is just 10 miles due west from here. And where will we be? 47 miles due east at a busy port of Massawa. Horn and I have just returned from it. It's far too busy a port to pull up on a stolen Mughal vessel, even if the white zombie no longer resembles itself. How long will it be anchored here? Garen chuckled. How long will we be gone? Along with Horn's original Abyssinians, I am only taking a handful of our best men, so that we travel quickly and discreetly. From what Pharaoh and Horn tells me, I hope it'll only take a few months. And then we'll return home? To France? Hell no. To America? Yes, it seems we have unfinished business. Almost 2 years ago, the locals reported a foreign warship docked for supplies with a destination of Aqaba next. It seems as if your Captain Blackbeard docked in Aqaba for a few months before sailing away to unknown waters. You and I both know where he's heading. Oh, I know. I just hope you trust me. Once we acquire Solomon's ring, we'll be able to turn the tables on the Order of Eos. Lesueur extended a hand, which Garen took, and with a loud groan, he helped him to his feet. Lead the way. Chapter 80. Massawa, Habesh Ayolet, 1708. The port of Massawa, shielded by numerous islands along the African coast, had once been part of the ancient kingdom of Aksum. Possession of the key African port shifted from the Ayyubid Caliphate, the Kingdom of Bejag, Portuguese, and finally to Ottoman control in 1557. The nearby mountainous country of Abyssinia, with its borders just 30 miles from the coast, repelled foreign influence for centuries and maintained robust trade at the Red Sea port. Even though the port didn't belong to Abyssinia, it signaled home for Benjamin Horn. My mission is only a failure if I stop now, he told himself, as the three skiffs approached the docks. Following the Ganji Swai incident, his superiors determined the time was ripe to attempt to regain the missing Ark of the Covenant. Ultimately, his superiors had been right about Eos moving their relics, but everything else about the mission fell apart. With the sun in his face as he rode, Benjamin Horn returned to Massawa with his head held high. He'd shed all his tears when he returned a few days earlier with Garen. Now he watched the survivors of his expedition return home. I must continue for those who died. They cannot have died in vain. Men who were only boys when they departed 13 years ago now set foot upon the docks of Massawa as freed men, and the other two skiffs were members of their sailing family: Drake, Murray, Jimmy Duke, Dr. Barrow, Narrowbon, Lesueur, and their newest and final master, Louis Armand Guerin. The crossing left Horn exhausted, but his men were a generation younger. Most of the original crew died in the first attack. Horn was kept because of his skill on a ship, and the younger boys for their gunnery skills. Most were in their late 20s now. They don't know what to do, Benjamin Horn realized as they fanned out onto the platform, suddenly surrounded by men who looked similar to them. I will go speak with them again, Horn shouted back to Garen, who paid the harbor master a fee to keep the skiff safe. Horn walked past his team, who were trying to reconcile childhood memories with what they were witnessing as men, 13 years after they had last been on African soil. Come, follow me. Having followed Horn for almost half their lives, the gun crewmen fell in line as Benjamin walked from the busy docks to the marketplace and finally to the shade of the mangrove trees that lined the coast. They departed with Horn as their leader, then found themselves captured by an Eos pirate ship, later to be captured by Korgi Baba, and finally by Captain Kidd in the Adventure Galley. Louis Armand Guerin freed them and returned them home. You are all now free men, Horn told them, and from this moment on, you follow me by your choice. As Garen promised we would long ago, he has brought you back to the land of your birth. As Garen promised long ago, he has brought you back to the land of your birth. I will stay with him as an equal, not a servant, because the road we walk must be walked together. We need each other to face the perils ahead, but this is far from the end of my journey. You've all served with honor and fought with bravery. Somewhere out there might be family members, brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews, and for a few of you, parents. Each of you has money to start a new life. You can find work right here in Masawa and put your own name on a ship. If you stay with me, I can guarantee many dangers ahead, possibly even death. But I can also promise you an adventure and wealth. This is where you must choose. Of the 7 who'd survived the journey, 6 stayed with Horn. They said their goodbyes to the one and then stayed shoulder to shoulder with their aging leader. Then let us unload our supplies. On the platform, the motley crew of pirates loaded supplies upon their shoulders and backs and walked into the city. Benjamin Horn led the way, with the 6 white foreigners following at the rear of the procession. As decided, Horn acted as leader of the expedition into Abyssinia. Under Horn's feigned leadership, they purchased more supplies and transportation horses. In just a few hours, the tasks were accomplished. And now we walk, Horn declared, and led the men out of the town. How far is it? Jimmy Duke called out. 2 days until we reach the mountains. Then we will see how you fare. Chapter 81, Aksum, Abyssinia. For Josiah Pharaoh, the mountains of Abyssinia looked the same as the vassal state of Hablish Aelet, yet Benjamin Horn insisted they looked quite different. The region was dry, yet they crossed through river and stream beds that indicated the rainy season had to be quite intense. The mountains were a series of peaks with deep valleys and a sprinkling of short trees and shrub growth due to the seasonal droughts. Pharaoh understood how the people of Ethiopia had repelled foreign invaders and interlopers for thousands of years. Each mountain was a defensible fortress overlooking fertile ravines. Over the past several days, their expedition had traveled almost 200 miles with no notice or fanfare. At each village or town, Horn would walk ahead, speak with the authorities, and women and children would bring out so much food that their sacks of supplies began to feel superfluous. Who is this man? Pharaoh wondered, trying to discern how Horn parted the figurative thickets of thorns with ease. Another man who fascinated Pharaoh was Naroban, the navigator. In a way, he reminded him of Nagari, the prison cook from his Kalish expedition. Each day, Ban would find time to walk with him for a few minutes, and then press for anecdotes about his life. Coming out of the mountains, they paused once again for Horn to clear the path for the large village below. It was unlike any of the mountain villages in the area. Aside from the span of the large valley, which tripled the footing space for anything of recent note, the city was nestled in between several volcanic lumps. While the Tigray Mountains continued on the opposite side of the valley, with a distinct wall that indicated days of mountainous travel ahead, from the relatively flat valley floor, rocky boils rose up like festering acne upon youthful skin. The only one with tree growth had a top that appeared leveled off by God's trowel. The city flowed around 3 of these large mounds, which rose as fast as the mountain pass from which they emerged. Naroban approached once again for another exchange of tales. Ban sat beside him, and together they watched Horn descending the road toward the nearest of the 7 volcanic lumps. "This reminds me of a place from my home," Ban said. "It is a shame you spent all those years in prison because just a few hundred miles from Delhi are mountains so beautiful and tall they would cause you to weep." "Oh dear, he's under the impression I was in a prison the whole time." "And beyond the Himalayas," Ban continued, "in the land of my birth, there is a mountain just like those small rocky plumes which rises from the earth like a stairway to heaven." "You're speaking of Kalish, aren't you?" You know of Kalish? Bon asked, the wrinkles in his brow doubling. Pharaoh had kept his time on the mountain mostly to himself. My study of ancient religions is extensive, which is why the Templar pirates abducted me in the first place. Yes, I am very familiar with Kalish. In fact, it filled my thoughts in my final years as a prisoner of the Emperor. Truth disguised. So it rises in a similar fashion. Pharaoh could still picture the regal mountain as he was taken away to be traded for Henry Avery. Despite being a prisoner, he knew there were secrets to be found at Kalish. Bon nodded. If you are a professor of ancient religions, then you know why the Greek god Apollo drove his chariot across the sky, or how Ra and Apophis chased each other across the sky to create day and night. Nero reached down and picked up a medium-sized rock, which he held with his thumb and middle finger. Do you see how I have 2 fingers, 2 small points, which support the weight of the rock? Now, with my other hand, I can spin the stone upon these 2 axis points. Instead of a chariot, now imagine that my face is the sun, and as I rotate the stone, it goes from light to dark, doesn't it? Who needs Galileo when I have Nero Bond to explain modern astronomy? He smiled and nodded, waiting for the point to emerge. If information had value, he kept the currency gained during his trip to Kalish to himself. He'd spend it only if needed. Mount Kalish is the place in which our world is held, which is why it is a sacred place. It is where heaven and earth connect, Bond concluded, tossing the stone aside. With his finger in the dust, he began to draw a shape. From Kalish, 4 rivers flow, each in a different direction. A place where water flows in all directions, Lesueur said from several feet away, his finger pointing to Nero's diagram in the dust. I've been to such a place on the far side of the world. Lesueur, still a mystery. Despite being 50, Lesueur had the muscular body of a gladiator and the mind of a wizard. While no longer a prisoner of the Emperor, Pharaoh still yearned to know more. You called it the Stairway of Heaven. Why is that? It is the place where Tampa Sherab came down from heaven to earth, thousands of years before Buddha or Jesus the Christ. Thousands of years before Christ would mean Tanpa Shenrab came to humans during the dawn of humanity, as the Templars saw it. Tell me the story of Tanpa Shenrab, Pharaoh requested. You would be disappointed by my tales, for Tanpa Shenrab is not an epic hero as in other religions. His example is the opposite, a peacemaker, for his stories deal with enlightenment and introspection, an example for regular humans to follow instead of a life of madness like the one I've been living. Shenrab renounced his royalty at an early age, chose to wander the earth, and lived in nature. It is said that when his natural life came to an end, the mountain opened up to take him into her bosom. And there it is, strange confirmation of an ancient theory. Pharaoh glanced down to the valley, where the Pied Piper Benjamin Horn led another throng of children as they followed him back up the mountain pass. In your stories, does Shenrab receive stone tablets with ancient words written upon them? Or perhaps runes like the Odin stone? The 10 Commandments? Lesueur scoffed. You think Shenrab is Moses, rejecting his Egyptian mother to wander the world seeking enlightenment? Pharaoh chuckled. A brute, but not a fool. Hearing it out loud, I see your point, Charlie. Let me rephrase the question, Master Bon. I've read ancient stories, predating Moses, from the Dawn era, where the secrets of the universe were written upon large rectangular blocks of stone, and after a great cataclysm, the stones were brought to Kalish, carried into its interior through a secret entrance. The one used by Shenrab? Bon asked. Is that your theory? Many legends share common truths. Perhaps these 2 accounts share a common item, a secret entrance. LeSueur leaned back. Where are you going with all of this? I'm chasing after a shadow, a figure without a name, even if he has 1,000 different names. Across the earth, 1,000 pieces of him remain, and I've spent my life trying to understand this puzzle. Pharaoh looked to confirm that it was only him, Ban, and LeSueur. All the others were thinking the dull thoughts of a warrior soldier as they sharpened blades and cleaned weapons, except for Louis Armand Guerin, who walked to where they talked. Who is he? LeSueur asked. The first alchemist? If you are telling the truth, he is the one who created the thing you held in your hands. You're searching for Charlie's father? Guerin called out from a distance. I've seen what Charlie holds in his hands each time he relieves himself. Pharaoh and LeSueur laughed while Ban only wrinkled his forehead. Guerin waved Pharaoh to him. This village is unlike anything we've seen before, and I'm going to need your help understanding some of the clues left behind. The expedition followed Benjamin Horn into the ancient city of Aksum. As they neared the first bluff, a crowd of old men, women, and children came out of their homes to study them as foreigners, but also celebrate them as sailors, one of which was remembered from years earlier. At first, the children studied LeSueur with wide eyes, but after a few blocks, they were climbing all over him as he gave rides upon his broad shoulders. Guerin paid it no attention and kept his gaze upon the path. Once they passed by the first bluff, a peculiar sight came into view between the central bluff and the western wooded bluff. Are those pillars? Pharaoh was so focused on the gray stela that he almost jumped when he saw a series of Christian churches at the beginning of the cut between the two hills. From one of the churches, the local priest focused his attention on Horn. Benjamin Horn conversed with a gray-haired priest for several minutes in their own language. Upon seeing Pharaoh's reaction, he translated. Aksum has been a Christian city since the 3rd century. The tallest stele ahead is the obelisk of King Azana, who brought Christianity to all the people of Ethiopia, not just those who dwell in caves. While ornate and quite old, it didn't explain what had rattled Guerin. Cave dwellers? What is that supposed to mean? Pharaoh asked. Horn pointed to the wooded bluff. On top of that hill, there is an observatory, where the ancients studied the stars. It is said that one of the Magi, a godly man born centuries before the rest of the heathen in Aksum became believers, visited the Christ in Judea and lived upon that very hill. And the kings of Tarshish and all the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall also offer gifts. Pharaoh remembered the passage from the psalmist. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hand to God. Pharaoh knew of many theories about the origin of the Magi. Horn continued chattering away with his guide as they walked down the streets. 300 yards from the field of Stela, they turned toward a small church. Barrow, Duke, Murray, and the others all pressed closely in shared wonder. Horn explained. Inside that church is an ancient relic that every man, woman, and child would die to protect. And few foreigners have ever been this close. Pharaoh's eyes noticed the squadrons of men upon the hilltops, guardians who watched their every move. Although there are grander churches, the church at the center of this city holds the special honor of being the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. Or at least one of the replicas, Pharaoh smirked. The Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem, Dr. Barrow said faster than Pharaoh could process. It was taken up to heaven by God following the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Why would it be in this place? Guerin shared glances with LeSueur, Horn, and Pharaoh. The four already knew the full story. Horn explained. Each church in Ethiopia holds an Ark of the Covenant, just like churches in Europe have replicas of the cross that held Christ. The folks in Aksum claim theirs to be the original. Only God knows. Guerin interrupted. Our tour is not over, gentlemen. Master Horn and our guide will have other wonders to show you. You're saying that the tablets written by God's fingers are inside of the golden chest with angels sitting upon it? Jimmy Duke added. Inside of that little church. I can assure you, Jimmy, that it is quite safe, and will continue to be quite safe, Garen added. Our friends here have watched us for the last few days, but even now, knowing that we are allies, it is quite secure. Look around you. Garen pointed to hundreds of eyes looking down from the bluff. Come, there is much more to see, Horn explained, and just 2 blocks later he stopped at an intersection of roads. Centuries before King Azana brought Christianity to the masses, the people of Aksum already worshipped the same god as the Hebrews, and down that road, on the edge of town, are the ruins of Dongar Palace, where countless kings and queens ruled. You asked why the Ark of the Covenant would be brought to Aksum? Do you see that large pool on the far side of the Garden of Stella? That is the Pool of Makeda, once the Queen of Sheba, who came to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. The Queen of Sheba from the Bible? Pharaoh asked. The same one. Horn nodded. When she departed Jerusalem, she returned with much more than answers. She stole the ark? That timeline doesn't make sense, Barrow added. No, she did not steal the ark, but she did return bearing a child who became Menelik the first, ruler of Ethiopia and father to the nation of Aksum and now Abyssinia. He was one of 7 heirs, including the line that brought forth the Christ, which is why the Magi came from the east, and also Ethiopia. When Jerusalem fell, the ark was brought here for safekeeping so that it did not fall into the hands of the Babylonians. For 2,000 years it has been safely kept here, despite attempts to claim it. It fits the narrative found in the Bible without any proof, Pharaoh realized. The only way to prove it was real would be to touch it, and drop dead according to the Bible. To understand, you must see something important, Horn said. It's not far. He led them through the intersection of streets to the short wall that surrounded the narrow Garden of Stella, where more than a dozen gray stelae pointed to the sky, and another dozen lay upon the ground in a state of shattered collapse. The largest obelisk, almost 80 feet tall, had ornate carvings over its facade. Much like Emperor Constantine is celebrated for making Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire and creating the Catholic Church, so too is King Azana celebrated for bringing Christianity to all the people. But you referenced a connection deep into the Old Testament times, Pharaoh said. Yes, but before that, it was underground. Horn walked up to the large obelisk, the gunners staying with the priest, and only the 5 foreigners continued. For as long as our people can remember, obelisks have been used for royal grave markers, and below the spire, the leader is laid to rest. We've been granted permission to visit the crypts in order to explain why we must be allies in the days to come. After lighting torches and lanterns, Horn led them to a small square opening in the ground, and although he could crouch down and fit through, the sewer almost had to crawl to enter. Once they reached the bottom of the stone-carved stairs, the passage opened up, yet LeSueur still had to hunch over. The stone around Aksum is volcanic, and with limited effort, hammer and chisel can create tunnels. The ones you see connect the crypts together. Pharaoh counted his steps, understanding the general direction and distance they traveled. Sure enough, they stopped at a place where water leaked from the wall into the floor. We're under the Pool of Makeda, Pharaoh said. LeSueur flinched when he understood the implication. There's enough water in that pool to flood these tunnels, isn't there? Yes, it is possible to use the water to flood the tunnels, which means our lives are in the hands of someone above us, right now. But we are being allowed to enter here with the knowledge we are not thieves. However, the water serves 2 purposes, death and rebirth. While the water can be used to kill our enemies, it can also be used to hide the truth from our enemies also. A valve, a way to evacuate as well as to trap. Yes, I wanted you to see it first, so you can understand the significance of the next two things you are about to see. Horn continued his tour, torch in hand, taking them through the twists and turns of the sealed crypts. Finally he stopped, letting the men fan out in front of the tomb. Templar symbols, Pharaoh recognized. The images appeared roughly cut as if a vandal had hastily marked them. The chiseled graffiti desecrated the older art and decorations. Aside from the most obvious marking, the Templar cross, two riders on a horse, and the pentagram symbol created the horned goat of Baphomet lore. Horn knelt down to change angles for the men to view what Pharaoh saw immediately. When the Great Crusades reclaimed the Holy Lands, Palestine was much different than the accounts described in the Gospels, for the Romans did everything in their power to erase Judaism from the earth, especially the Holy City. For some reason, the Templars foolishly believed the Ark would be sitting pristine in the Jerusalem temple, and when they could not find it, they were left with two realizations. It had been taken to heaven by angels, Dr. Barrow offered, or it had been relocated by men. Within a few decades of exhausting all efforts in the rotting corpse of Jerusalem, the Templars struck out for Aksum, and with a relatively small force of Templar knights, retraced the legends back to the obelisk of Queen Makeda, which they toppled. Can you imagine the restraint it took the Aksumite guards to stand back and let it happen? These sons of Solomon, as they saw themselves, did not look kindly upon the bastard heirs of their master mason, which is why we let Queen Makeda's tomb be easily discovered. The Templars found their way down here and left these marks on our walls. Like a dog pissing on a tree, Duke added. What did they come down here for? Dr. Barrow asked. I will show you, Horn said. Pharaoh understood where they stood in relation to the surface, to the footsteps that had taken him. But Drake, Duke, Garin, Charlie, and Dr. Barrow looked up at the ceiling for a few moments before he explained it to him. It's a trap door to the church. Drake stepped backwards as if in danger. The Ark of the Covenant rests above us? Perhaps, Horn answered, but only the high priest at the time knew the truth, didn't he? The Templars took a treasured relic and showed their true colors in the process. Within a century, they surrendered Jerusalem to Saladin and returned home more powerful than any individual European nation. Shortly before the papal bull destroyed their order, the Templars were making plans to invade Ethiopia, just as they were planning to do in recent days. What does that tell you? They suspected they were tricked, Murray added, still looking around the tunnel. Or they were searching for something of greater value, Horn explained. Luckily, such a relic is not kept in such an accessible location. I wanted all of you to see this place before we continued. And a magical ring would be quite easy to hide, Pharaoh decided, as they found their way out of the tunnel. Chapter 82, Lalibela, Abyssinia, 1708. Pierre-Charles Lesueur thought back on a lifetime of Christmas celebrations. He remembered the cathedral in Artois, France, when he was just a boy. The choir and pipe organ filled the space with such melody that he felt as if he were a shepherd on the night of Christ's birth. He remembered a Christmas celebration on the shores of Lake Huron when he frantically gathered up symbolic items for the better part of a day before Father Jacques Marquette turned the mundane into holy symbols to act out the Christmas story for a crowd of 3 voyagers, 2 métis, and a family of Wyandotte converts. Once, in the deep snows of Mankato, he and a crew of 30 men sang carols together around a large bonfire. Each man dressed with a pelt of a buffalo, a bellowing herd of carolers. At the time, he smiled, unaware of the daggers in the smiles of the others. For another Christmas, during a winter in Montreal, A heavy snowstorm forced him to load his wife Marguerite and his children onto a sled, which he pulled like a pack mule through 3 blocks of snow-packed streets until he brought his family to the church. He'd expended so much energy that his young wife had to elbow him during Mass. His favorite Christmas, until now, had always been the one he spent with bare-breasted Winona. The trading post on Mackinac Island had a small population of men who were baptized Christian but only professed their faith privately, leaving him without anyone to lead a traditional church service. So that Christmas Eve, he brought in a double stack of firewood, and soon the heat of the fireplace forced both of them to wear nothing but loincloth as they laid on a bearskin rug with only a Bible between them. He told her the nativity story that night, and she would counter with comparative details from her own Dakota traditions. It was the deepest exploration of biblical text he'd ever done, until he arrived in Lalibela. For the tallest peak of the mountain village, LeSueur sat with the rest of the foreigners. From the north and east, hundreds of white-robed pilgrims flowed together like a river of humanity at the bottom of the hill. As the 2 currents crashed together, singing and dancing presided. There was no choir director or pipe organ to guide the pilgrims, only the collective will of the people. Somewhere, a southern road and western road brought in 2 other veins of pilgrims, but LeSueur could not see them, for all along the western slope of his perch, a great sea of white covered the mountain village like a glacier. Like Zacchaeus in a tree, he watched the joyous throngs as they crushed together into the churches below. Their timing had either been terribly or divinely ordained, for no sooner had they begun their climb up the hill to the sacred city than the white-robed pilgrims began to arrive. As always, Benjamin Horne found food, shelter, and a warm welcome for them. But their tour of the site would have to wait until after the Christmas celebration ended. So they camped upon the hill, overlooking it, and all and watched. While Horne spoke with the church elders, LeSueur only caught the translated names for the churches, but he quickly locked those details away in his head. Farthest away, to the north side of the Sea of White, were 5 churches, or bietes, as the local priests called them. House of the Savior of the World, House of Mary, House of the Cross, House of the Virgins, House of Golgotha Michael, were so tightly constructed that almost looked like pilgrims were vanishing into an underwater cistern. Yet the bodies continued to pour into the spaces of worship. The River Jordan divided the complex. Of course, LeSueur knew immediately that it wasn't the Jordan, or even a river for that matter, that divided the complex in half. It only took a few minutes to understand that the channel had not been formed by water, or any other natural process. Later, he was promised by Guerin, we'll get a thorough explanation. Sitting on a hill overlooking it all, he understood why it was called New Jerusalem. Just as the ancient Holy Lands had been divided between the 12 tribes into Israel in the north and south in Judea, a symbolic Jordan River etched into solid rock, which was now filled with waiting pilgrims, divided the 2 regions. A solitary church to the extreme west, House of St. George, was symbolically disconnected from the Holy Land metaphor, something he also intended to ask about later. LeSueur observed that the House of Emmanuel, House of St. Mary Croesus, House of Abbot, Libanos, House of Gabriel Raphael, and House of Holy Bread revealed a bit of magic. All 11 churches were built below ground level into the stone of the mountain. If they'd been above ground, they would have risen as high as any cathedral, but instead, the subterranean structures filled with celebratory pilgrims. I shall never have a more glorious Christmas celebration, LeSueur decided, and even though separated from the crowd by distance, language, and culture, he joined their prayers with theirs, hoping the short distance to heaven would help them be heard. If God will still listen to the prayers of this sinner, he concluded. Garin, the man who forced him to leave that little cabin he once shared with Winona, and all the other pirates seemed to be sharing their own private reconciliations with God. In a few more days, the quest would resume, and Garin and Horn would be leading them to the next mystical location. Long ago, LeSueur had released himself to the wind that blew from place to place, and unlike Garin, no longer tried to steer his way through the storm. Yet one question suddenly troubled him, so he counted again. And he confirmed it following the quick tour he'd been given around Jerusalem. If ancient King Lalibela fashioned the complex on the Hebrew Holy Land all the way down to a fabricated Jordan River, then why were there only 11 churches yet 12 tribes, or 12 disciples? Where is the 12th church? Chapter 83, Lalibela Abyssinia, 1709. Louis Armand Garin couldn't shake the idea. A city revealed. Below his feet, cut from solid rock at the top of a mountain, the churches of Lalibela stood, surrounded by stone that once surrounded them. Sculptors would begin by looking at a block of marble and trying to imagine what existed within. Instead of creating art like a painter, a sculptor revealed what had always been there. In the same way, the designer of the churches of Lalibela stood where he stood and imagined a city below the rock that supported his feet. He kept his thoughts about the complex to himself during the private tour. They descended the same steps used by the pilgrims a week earlier. His hands reached to the rock walls that still belonged to the mountain, feeling the texture, grain, and density of the stone. Upon the ridges of his fingers, he felt dusty residue, a sign that the stone was relatively soft. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he looked up at the towering walls of the house of the Savior of the world. It took his breath away. The others in the party peppered Horn and the local priest with predictable questions, which brought predictable answers, as well as the history of the place. How old is this place? Who did this? How was it made? With the fall of the Holy Lands in 1187, King Lalibela determined a new Jerusalem needed to be built. Modeled on Israel, the subterranean churches were cut inside and out from solid stone, along with the artificial channel of the Jordan River and also a tunnel system that connected all the churches. Each church was a masterpiece unto itself, with ornate pillars, doors, windows, roofs, and floors. Above, in the village, stacked stones and thatched roofs served the people well for centuries. Here, in the mountain itself, something divine existed. While the exterior of the churches looked like giant sand castles, the interior of the churches inspired reverent awe. Garin looked past the decor, medieval art fitting of the era of King Lalibela, to the precision of every wall and dome. The longer he stayed, the more agitated he felt. Everything was too perfect, supernaturally perfect. He imagined 1,000 hired workers with hammer and chisel. Then he imagined 12 workers, skilled mathematicians with the finest technology to follow angle and plane. While his rational mind struggled, his heart knew the answer to the mystery. He'd first learned the theory as a periphery student back in Rome. Years later, contemplated the theory after his visit to the frontier, and finally accepted the theory after he met the prisoner Benjamin Horn. The finest engineers in Rome, Greece, or Egypt did not build like this, for they would assemble archaeological masterpieces block by block, and if error was detected, a block would be dismissed and another fashioned. At Lalibela, there were no blocks. Each church, with its straight walls, began from the top and worked down. A single lapse of judgment or missed hit ruined everything, like a sculptor knocking off the nose of a bust. Flawless. A single church would take a lifetime to shape to such perfection, for fear of error would inhibit the workers with constant measurement. Then, after achieving external perfection, to bore into the solid block to create rooms. "How long did this take to make?" Garin finally asked. The tour guide paused. King Lalibela did not become ruler until 1181, and upon his death in the year 1221, he was laid to rest at Bet Abba Libanos. Would you like to see his tomb? Garin contemplated the answer as they walked through the underground tunnel under the pseudo-Jordan River and emerged in a courtyard of 3 churches. Bet Abba Libanos was one of the smallest, yet no less grand. "You avoided my question earlier." Garin said after the guide finished his description of King Lalibela's resting place. "But you already have my answer," the guide countered. King Lalibela determined that after the fall of Jerusalem, Christians needed a new home for pilgrimage, and when he died, he was laid to rest. Such perfection in such a short amount of time was almost inconceivable. 4 decades? You're telling me that the entire complex was begun and completed in 4 decades? The guide's eyes twinkled before saying, "If not faster than that." For the second complex, they once again returned to the tunnel, which led them on an even longer expanse, once again under the Jordan River, to the isolated house of St. George. Like the others, it stood within the span of stone from which it was carved. Equally beautiful, it distinguished itself by being the tallest, or deepest, structure with walls 40 feet high. The guiding priest led them up the stairs that skirted the church. The men removed their footwear as instructed and stepped inside. Their bare feet found ornate, colorful rugs, by themselves a work of art, yet drab in comparison to the painted walls. The largest painting showed St. George upon a horse and slaying a dragon crawling upon its belly. The men studied it, perhaps finding personal meaning, but Garin soon fixed on the green curtain behind it. A white-robed priest sat comfortably in front of it. The Christmas celebration had been funneled to the northernmost complex, while this church stood isolated. "Please kneel," the priest in the chair said. Garin did as instructed, followed by his men. Their guide stepped towards the chair and stood beside it. "Before you continue on your quest, you must be purified, for your journey will be both perilous and divine. If this is God's will, then may His blessing and grace follow you when you return out into the world." Could it be this easy? Will the priest present us with Solomon's ring and wish us well? The priest stood, and together with the other priest, they parted the heavy green curtain. Within, the tablet stood upon the altar. A replica, or is it the real Ark of the Covenant? Does Horn even know? Garin readily received the blessing, knowing why they were there and where they were going. He also reflected on his own answer to the question he posed. The curtains were again closed, and in silence the men walked out of the church. An almost imperceptible staircase led them back to the surface, where they stood on the edge of the mountain, overlooking the valley below. The priest departed, and Jimmy Duke summarized the mood of the group when he plopped onto the ledge with a muttered, "Holy shit." The rest also bent their weary knees and dropped to the ground as well, including Benjamin Horn, the last to sit. "So you're from here?" Drake Murray asked Horn incredulously. "I was an acolyte of the church in my youth, selected and trained. When I was a young man, I was tasked with a purpose, and to achieve this purpose, I had to become a navigator upon a sailing vessel." "To be led by the grace of God on your quest to find the stolen ark," Pharaoh speculated. "There is no way these churches were carved during a span of a single king's reign," Dr. Barrow said. "Each one, if carefully monitored, would have taken 100 years, and with that, there would have been mistakes made. Benjamin Horn glanced over at Garin, who shrugged for a bit of information to be revealed to the crew. What the priest didn't say is that the construction of these churches is not credited to the work of men. The legend says that angels shaped these churches. Angels, Lesueur repeated, then looked to Garin. Is that what you think? Garin looked over at Horn. No, I don't think this place was built by angels, but I do think King Lalibela built this place in the same manner and fashion that King Solomon built the original temple in Jerusalem. During the reign of Cyrus the Great, the priest Ezra oversaw the rebuilding of the temple around the year 537, and while it was functional within 7 years, King Herod was still refurbishing it right up until the time of Christ, 5 centuries of remodeling. We have 11 churches around us as grand as the Second Temple. How did Solomon do it? Pharaoh locked eyes with him. He shaped unhewn stone with the shamir. But what controlled it? Lesueur asked. King Solomon's ring, Pharaoh admitted. It's what Tu and I were going to pursue before he was killed. In order for us to retrieve a treasure, Garin said, turning to Horn, we will need a treasure. A skeleton key to pick a lock. Solomon's ring. Benjamin Horn nodded. Then we will travel to the 12th church, the Church of Adam, and you can make your request to my superiors. Chapter 84, Yemrahana, Abyssinia. The oldest of the 12 churches was only a day's journey away from the other 11. From the village of Lalibela, Luis Armand Garin and his crew followed a high mountain path that led due east, and then along a high ridge that extended for almost 5 miles. All the men were careful and deliberate, watched by the heavens above, for on either side one misstep near the steep slopes meant certain death. When they woke the next morning, the Ethiopian mountains were blanketed by a dense fog, hiding the valley into which they descended. Once they reached the valley floor, walls of fog and mountain kept them cutting back and forth until they had no sense of which direction they were even walking. Yet Benjamin Horn and his team of young acolytes steadily led the way. By afternoon of the second day, they hiked out of the fog as they scaled a mountain. This mountain was not nearly as formidable as the spine they'd walked before, or as grand as the one upon which Mount Lalibela was built, but it was most unique of all they'd seen so far in Ethiopia, for tucked high in the mountains was a dense forest. They entered the hidden forest on its steepest end of the elevated ridge, following a trickle of water that grew as it slowly descended. With the thick canopy of juniper trees, the Ethiopian air was strangely humid, and Garin found himself touching moss upon the oldest trees along their path. With ridges rising on both sides of the sheltered woods, Garin realized the path they took was marked with small trinkets and colorful ribbons, and on several occasions he sensed movement. Unseen eyes followed them. Yes, there were colonies of small monkeys that watched upon the trees, but humans also watched, guarding. Soon, the creek expanded over the marshy ground, caught in a ladle that collected the water at the lowest part of the small forest. In fact, Garin could see the far side of the little ridge that collected the water and revealed the end of the mountainous paradise, where the ground dropped away to the dry valley below. In the rainy season, it would have been a lake hidden in the clouds. Standing on the shore of the marsh, Garin could see how vegetation filled the depression. He knew crossing the expanse by foot or horse meant sinking into its depths. Benjamin Horn neither looked at the marsh nor at the descending valley beyond it. Instead, he looked sharply to his left at the side of the depression. At first, Garin thought Horn only appreciated the beauty of the rock facade, draped with a green curtain of vines, but where the longest vines dangled down, he saw darkness, like a crescent moon on its side. In the dark smile of the crescent, teeth, a man-made wall stretched from corner to corner. What could a wall so far back be guarding? The wall has stood since the time of Christ, Horn said, but the church is the oldest in the world. The monks that live inside can trace oral history to the days of the dawn, and what we seek will be known here. Beyond the wall, a deep darkness extended as the natural overhang of the shave sheltered the wall, a structure within, and even more. As a military installation, the walled structure could have been defended effortlessly by a dozen men, who Garin had to assume were watching from the trees. As the party grew near, the wall took on another purpose: preservation. A trickle of water came down the dark gray facade of the mountain, dropped onto the deck of the cave floor, and leached away into the marsh. The wall shielded the cave from any intruder, including the elements. 3 simple but solid gates divided the wall into sections: Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Once inside, a small monastery stood in the opening of the massive cave. Built horizontally, dark wooden beams and light mortar created a striped appearance, and judging from the architecture of the doors and windows, the structure was several hundred years old. This was the first church to be built in this area, prior to the 11 built by King Lalibela, Horn explained. It is now called Unhewn Christos, built in reaction to the Crusades upon the Holy Land. Jerusalem was no longer safe for pilgrims, whether possessed by the Roman Catholic Church and its Templar Knights or by Caliph Saladin and his Muslim warriors, so it was decided that a new safe home needed to be built. Who decided? Indeed, Garin speculated out loud. A moment ago, you said this place is the oldest church in the world, yet built after the Crusades? The structure in front of you is only a few hundred years old, but the cave has been a place of worship and sanctuary far, far longer. The ground itself was artificial instead of stone. Between the stone wall and the monastery, a fabric of slender wooden reeds formed a woven mat that stretched for yards in all directions. Under his toes, Garin could feel the mat give slightly as they moved across it, a strange buoyancy that made their approach quiet. Colorful monks nodded and smiled, and the small band of men approached. Cups of coffee were offered to the travelers, along with a small offering of food, and soon they entered the structure. From the regal paintings to ornate ceiling tiles, Unhewn Christos was the most magnificent and meticulously kept church Garin had seen, but he had to push his feelings of awe back down in his soul as he kept a critical mind for keen observation. He recognized it was all a visual ruse. The church and monastery was as real as the monks who lived there. Of that he had little doubt. It was a true divine place of worship, worthy of pilgrimage from all of Christendom. When the tour ended, Horn led them back out the back door of the temple. Deeper in the cave, the light crawled over the ceiling, above the wall of the monastery, where a span of several yards remained. Each step they took, as the soles of their feet slid over the wooden platform, echoed inside of the massive space. Horn walked into the narrowing space until the wooden platform ended and the stone floor of the cave rose to accept them. Soon the angles of the floor and ceiling came together. The Sur reached up and touched the ceiling, but the angle continued for countless yards, as if leading into the underworld itself. At the place where a normal man could touch floor to ceiling, a pile of stacked rocks formed a low wall. Horn stepped aside so his friends could stand at the wall and peer into the deeper recesses. Corpses. Garin paused. The scene was not macabre, but nevertheless surprised him. Hundreds, if not thousands of corpses stretched out into the darkness. The acrid stench of death hung in the air, corralled seemingly by the low wall. Back of the entrance to the cave, light and life abounded, but here hell itself opened its mouth. These are the saints of our faith, the guardians of the sacred, the keepers of the truth. One day, I hope to pass beyond this low wall and have my weary bones join the bones of those who came before me. A catacomb of sorts. Horn turned and walked back toward the opening of the cave, but before he brought them all the way out, he stopped and sat. The others followed. Shortly after the rebirth of the New World, when humanity began to go forth over the face of the earth, there were no countries, cities, villages, or even houses to shelter the earliest travelers from the storm. Wherever a cave was discovered, it was viewed as a gift from God, and those places, like this one, became centers of worship and sanctuary. A network of caves served humanity in those days, and generation after generation flew away from their nests and out into the unknown world. It did not take early mankind long to learn how to fell trees and create thatched roofs, and then how to create brick and how to cut stone. But the monks who came to the caves remained. As time passed, some caves fell into disuse. Others were attacked by the ignorant and violent, but some remained, still networked together in common purpose. Despite being the guardians of mankind, these wardens of peace quickly became misunderstood, even feared. Although spread over continents and nations, they retained a common tongue, and from the ignorant earned a name, the cave divers. For living in caves, the title seemed appropriate, and when hunted, yes, my people would certainly dive back into the caves to vanish into the protective womb of the earth. Thus began a silent vigil. When darkness descended upon Egypt and the world during the days of Moses, our people already understood how to live in darkness. Just as you and I found ourselves together on a ship, Moses crossed paths with our kind as well. The young prince of Egypt, during a war against Nubia, found his way back to the light by walking into the darkness. He sat where you sit now and worshipped God in a church of unhewn stone. Later, during his exile from Egypt, he found another priest and a smaller cave at a different mountain. For 40 years he trained and prepared in a way the Egyptian court could never prepare him until God called him from Midian back to the land of Egypt. As young Christians, I'm sure you know this part of the story. Garin wasn't sure if his crew had such an understanding, yet they listened reverently. While this cave was not the first place of worship, it remains the oldest place of continued worship. When Queen Makeda traveled to King Solomon, monks were here. When the Magi were summoned to bring holy treasures to the Christ child, monks were here. When crusaders invaded the Holy Lands, monks were here. As time passed, it was decided that a new home needed to be built, a new cave, located in the heart of society but tucked away from sight. On the periphery, Garin muttered aloud, thinking of the underground complex in Rome that housed the order. This is why Horn allied himself with me. He wanted to bring me home. Yes, the periphery, Horn affirmed. Rome became a new complex with a new purpose, while we remained here at an old cave with an old purpose. Now our two branches have come together, and you and I will go together to make our request. Benjamin Horn stood back up, and the rest of the men followed. The rest of you must wait here. Garin and I must go together, for each of us has a separate request to make. Where are you taking him? Lesueur asked, suddenly protective. Horn pointed to the left wall of the cave. There is an inner cave that is only accessible to those who know the secret path. To enter, we must receive a special baptism. Horn gestured to the church of Yemrahena. They are waiting. Chapter 85, Yemrahena, Abyssinia, 1709. As Louis Armand Garin rested upon his knees beside Horn, the priest who'd been feeding syllables of prayer paused. Instead of rising, the old man simply leaned forward and grabbed the small rug between them. Pulling it away, he revealed a wooden thatched door. It was similar to the construction of the decking in the front of the cave, but when he lifted it and set it aside, a pool of water reflected a mirror image of them. Having seen dozens of baptismal fonts in a dozen churches around the world, Garin understood that his cleansing would not be with a cup of water within a hand. Horn nodded, stood back up, and began to strip away his clothing. The three men were in an inner room, not much larger than a closet, where modesty was not an issue. Horn stopped disrobing while still wearing a small loincloth, whereas Garen had baggy breeches. "We must submerge yourself in the water. The priest will take us by the hair and not release us until the proper time. Is that understood?" Obviously, this isn't a typical baptism. "I think so." "I will go first," Horn said, and sat down next to the hole in the floor. He put his feet over the edge of the dark water, kept his hand on the side, and then slid in. He bobbed in the water past his head, and then his right hand reached up to the other side of the opening. With both hands balancing him in the water, he looked up to the priest and nodded. The priest reached out his hand and placed it upon Horn's head. With a nod, Horn took a deep breath and submerged. The priest kept his hand in place, just a few inches below the surface of the water. He looked up and smiled warmly. After a few moments passed, Garen realized the submersion was a test of sorts. He began an internal clock for his friend, whose fingers quivered slightly upon the edge of the opening. The darkness of the water alarmed him, for its depth not only provided for a grown man to submerge, but also held no reflection of light to indicate the side or bottom of the baptismal chamber. A deck. The path that led them from the highest part of the hidden forest steadily descended for almost a mile until they reached the depression in front of the cave. While the marsh in front of the cave was filled with vegetation, the depth of the swamp could not be determined. The wall, the deck, built at the surface level of the marsh to insinuate that it was built upon solid earth. But a floating sanctuary? Garen's mind reviewed the construction of the cave and suddenly felt short of breath. Did the waters below Horn's feet descend for 6 feet or 60? Was the pool built up thousands of years ago to flood the area for security reasons? A moat for an ancient castle? Of course, the cave divers. This is no baptism. This is a test to see how long I can hold my breath. Finally, the hand came off of Horn's head, and he burst to the surface with a gasp. He pulled himself out of the opening, allowing Garen to take his place. The water was not frigid, but it certainly had a chill that took his breath away for a moment, indicating the true depth of the water under his feet. He let himself slide quickly into the abyss, not even holding onto the edges. But his feet did not find anything below, and when his hands reached back up to the edges of the opening, he felt his heart pounding in anticipation. The priest looked down at him, and Garen nodded in affirmation, submersing himself into the water. As he counted in his mind, he opened his eye. The dim light from the church filtered into the water around him, and he could see the bottom of the hidden lake. At the deepest, the clear water descended for 20 feet. Along the sides, he could see the sharp accent that formed the walls, as well as the rear of the cave that held the bones of the saints. To the left, though, he saw a dark opening just below where the floating timbers anchored to stone. Is that where we're going? In the center of the dark eye, he saw a faint light, indicating another chamber beyond. The pressure on his hair released, and for good measure, he stayed for a few more seconds before bursting to the surface. Benjamin Horn slid in beside him. "Have you ever done this before?" Garen asked. "No, but there is an old man beyond that wall who keeps vigil. If we wanted, there is a place outside, past the cave, where monks can remove a series of boulders to drain the water so we can pass safely. But I told them we are both strong swimmers. You are a strong swimmer, aren't you?" "Let's race and find out. I'll meet you on the other side, or else in the afterlife." Chapter 86. Ymrahena, Abyssinia, 1709. Benjamin Horn paused when his hands touched the opening to confirm that Garen was on his heels. He was. The light at the surface now seemed as if a window of heaven had opened, but the chill of the water and the ache in his lungs reminded him of his mortality. Once Garen caught him, he finished the turn toward the surface. He opened his mouth slowly, releasing his spent air and taking a controlled breath. Garen breathed like a panicked newborn. The water in Horn's eyes kept him from seeing clearly. First, he saw a pair of feet and ankles just a few feet from where they rose from the abyss. The irregular rocky walls behind him came into focus next. Not sandstone, mortar, timber, or tapestry, but unhewn stone. The original cave, now hidden from the world. But it wasn't cut off from the world. The aging monk with white patchy hair, a thin beard, jovial eyes, and a lean but healthy body was surrounded by texts, creature comforts, and even a tray of fresh food. Then Horn noticed the most peculiar thing about the bizarre world they had entered. Holes. The holes acted as windows to the open sky above, but most were only a few inches in diameter, and perfect. Each was a shaft meant to catch the light from the sun as it passed above the sky, a strange clock that illuminated the chamber with both diffused light and also a direct beam of light. From the comments of his childhood mentors, Horn suspected places like this existed, but now, as an older man, he had confirmation. While he hadn't yet found the lost Ark, he'd brought back an ally. "Looks like we've come to the right place," Garen said, observing the same holes. They climbed out of the watery passage just a few feet from where the priest smiled at them. Although isolated from the outside world, the priest could still be reached both vocally and with written messages via the tubes. Horn spoke in Amharic. "I am Genet Kennedy, a trained disciple from Washa Kokebi, and I have come with my friend to ask a question." "Who is your friend?" "He is Luis Armand Garen from Washa Tekula." "I am Father DeWilly. Does your friend come directly from Rome?" "No, he has traveled to the far side of the world and sailed upon many seas to come here. He has not been to Washa Tekula for many years. We found each other by chance, and common purpose has brought us together." "Common purpose?" Father DeWilly said with a tone of suspicion. "It has been more than 1,000 years since we have had common purpose with Washa Tekula. What does he want?" "He has found the stone the mason rejected." This took the smile off of Father DeWilly's face. "Your ancestor Kokebi claimed to have found the stone in a mystical land where the water flows in all directions and the earth bleeds blue. Have you seen this place? Have you witnessed the stone?" "No, the one who pulled it from the earth has thrown it into the depths of the ocean," he said in reference to Lesueur. "Perhaps that is for the best, for the one who made it was evil, and his works even more. We might worship the same God, the same Holy Spirit, and the same Christ as our northern brothers, but they do not understand the past the way we do. What does he know about Zikinteia? Zikitinia. There we go. At this, Horn paused, looking over to a patient Garen, who understood little of what they said. "Father DeWilly asked me what you know about the Alchemist and his stone." "What name did he just use for the Alchemist?" Garen pressed. "Zikitinia," Horn repeated. "It's not a proper name as much as it is a title. It means the Low One." "The Low One." The Hebrews used a similar name for the human king who was brought low. "I'm familiar with the legend of Zikintenia, who is known by many other names," Garen answered. Horn nodded and began to translate. Garen interrupted to add, "Tell him that our shared enemies wish to find him, and that the periphery, Washa Tekula, intends to stop this from happening. Explain to him what we did in Madagascar, and then explain how our plan will cripple the efforts of the Order of Eos from ever attaining their purpose. Tell him that is why we've passed through earth and water." Horn nodded and returned to his native tongue. "I've spent many years with this man, and he understands Zikatenya, even if his people do not use the same name. Of course, no one should speak the cursed name, which is why we use the name Zikatenya." Horn continued his explanation. As a representative of Washatakula, he said their intention is to stop our common enemies from reaching the tomb of Zikatenya, which is why they have cast the key into the depths. Our enemies are resilient, however, and either by technology or sorcery, they intend to resurrect their Dark Messiah. The secret knowledge to do this is kept in a locked vault, which cannot be accessed by natural means. Horn explained what happened in Madagascar and also what they intended to do. While he explained the plan, the old priest seemed to nod in approval. "And where is this vault?" the monk finally asked. "I have no clue. I can only hope Garen told the truth." Horn turned to Garen. "He wants to know more about the vault." "Tell him I visited it during my travels to the far side of the world," Garen said. "It is found on a sacred island. Only those who built the vault can access it, which is why they keep their greatest treasures locked away inside of it. Tell him the periphery has always known about the travels of Kokebi during the reign of King Solomon, and that our enemies have maps that led them to the area. But they do not understand the map, nor do they understand the truth about Zikatenya." Horn translated. The priest now frowned. "If I grant your request, it could be turned against us for foul purposes. If Zikatenya's stone has been cast into the sea, then why do we disturb the sleeping lion?" Upon repeating the question, Garen exhaled and hung his head. "Another enemy is coming to destroy the prophecies by destroying the relics." "The priory?" Horn confirmed. Garen nodded. "The prophecy doesn't just include the key, which is the Philosopher's Stone, but it also mentions the Ark of the Covenant. Once the priory discovers the vault on Oak Island, they will have no qualms destroying everything in it, including the Lost Ark. Tell him the sleeping lion will wake one way or another, but if it is killed while sleeping in its den, then the prophecies will crumble like ash." Horn explained it to the priest, who asked a question. "And will he return the missing ark to us when it is over?" Garen confirmed he would. "The item you seek is dangerous," the priest added. "It corrupted Solomon to the doom of Israel. What makes you think it will obey your commands?" Horn translated and waited for Garen's answer. Garen nodded. "We have a ring bearer." Chapter 87. Abuna Yamada Gu, Abyssinia. Pierre-Charles Lesueur had been born of flesh in Artois, France, in 1657. Hiding along an earthen bank of a Wisconsin river, he was transformed into the vengeful Paul Bonjean, scourge of the Great Lakes. Later, in the fires of a Sioux pyre, he became a treasure hunter for evil men. In the waters of the high seas, he transformed a third time into Charlie Johnson, first mate and namesake of the White Zombie. Now, almost 9,000 feet above sea level, he did the exact opposite of what he was told to do. He looked down at the 1,000-foot drop below him. "Will the air transform me into my final self?" His bare feet shuffled along the sandstone cliff while his hands searched for any tangible hold to keep his body from tumbling backwards to his death. Had he been a younger man and not an aging relic of the previous century, he might have been able to turn away from the wall as Duke and Murray did, but the climb had turned his legs to jelly, and he doubted any of the great strength left in his body. His girth, too, inhibited his progress, for his shoulders, belly, and chest filled the narrow passage high up in the sky. While the others certainly carried their fears, he could see from their eyes that they worried about him falling over the edge. "Take a breath, Charlie," Dr. Barrow said behind him. "You are breathing heavily, and your muscles need air to function." LeSueur realized it was true. He was holding on to his breath. So he forced himself to take a deep breath, but that only caused spots to appear, and the wobbling in his legs doubled. "If I'm going to fall, I am going to fall. I am going to pass out and tumble backwards to my death." "Keep shuffling your feet, Charlie. The path widens just a few feet ahead, and you can rest," Dr. Barrow said. Ahead of them, Professor Farrow reached the wide area and turned back around to watch LeSueur clinging to the wall. The others kept on going, vanishing around the bend. Just a few more yards. The slippery residue between his toes grew, for he did not lift his feet on those final spans. As the space between the wall and the ledge grew, he slowly crouched down, his head against stone the whole time, until he panted like an animal on all fours. Farrow waited and offered him water. Dr. Barrow patted him on the square of his back. After catching his breath, LeSueur rotated his hips and sat down against the wall, his bare feet pointed toward the open sky. Early in the morning, all 9 of them woke at their camp upon the valley floor. LeSueur had eaten 3 eggs, gobbled down a local breakfast meal called chesheba, and tried a strain of Ethiopian coffee, which had fueled him for much of the leisurely stroll up the narrow paths. Even though they climbed a mountain, it had been easy to focus on the path, even though they had to climb up and over boulders. Ascent allowed him to put one foot in front of the other like he was climbing stairs. Then they reached a balcony of stone. The local priests had used a pointed finger to show a path that they would take up the mountain. They'd pointed out the balcony, a narrow passage across the sheer cliff face that led to the final leg of their ascent. But LeSueur tried to focus his eyes on the spire atop the mountain, the place where a tiny church had been carved from stone. Abuna Yamada Gu was named after a Christian monk who'd established the secret church more than a millennium ago. At the time of its shaping, the Romans had driven Christianity underground and Jerusalem had been leveled. Even in Ethiopia, threats from Nubia and Arabia required a stronghold, an island, to be established for the flowing currents of political upheaval. Father Yamada spent a lifetime designing the ascent and the church. "It's times like this that a fellow can look back on his life with regret," LeSueur said, with a sigh, the shaking in his legs over and his breath in his lungs back. "Strange," Farrow said. "I was thanking the Creator for leading me on this path that brought me to this time and place. What do you regret?" "All the lies I have told to myself and others," LeSueur began, and then realized that perhaps God had buckled his knees to force a confession out of him. "Perhaps if I lighten my load, let go of my burden I carry, I will be able to reach the top and unpack my great lie." Instead, Dr. Barrow made a confession. "I paid a gang of ruffians to bring me mortally wounded men from bars and taverns, men who had no chance of survival yet still clung to life, so that I could operate on them, and in doing so, understand how the body functioned. Only later did I learn that these ruffians preyed upon innocent bystanders, inflicting the wounds themselves, knowing I would pay them." "I have worshipped false gods," Farrow next confessed. "I tried to rationalize that humans worship the same God in many different ways, that the little details shouldn't matter because my Creator would know it's all the same. It only allowed me to pick and choose a faith that suited my sins, and the God I created was fashioned in my image. I once held a chance to become a husband of a beautiful Dakota woman, LeSueur revealed. She'd been born a princess to a mighty king, but during a battle, she was taken prisoner, sold, and turned into a slave whore. For rescuing her from slavery, she wanted to express her gratitude in the only way she knew how, and I denied her. Barrow scoffed. How is showing virtue something worthy of guilt and confession? Winona, that was her name, LeSueur continued. I should have made love to her until my arms and legs were weary. Why didn't I love her fully? I could have built her a home and lived the rest of my days in happiness. Now I am a world away on this damn mountain with a bladder full of piss. I agree with Barrow, Farrow said. I still don't understand your sin or your lie. I lied to myself that I had honor, that I had virtue. I ignored the whore so that I could save myself for a chaste young lady who turned out to be the real whore, a Delilah that betrayed me. What a fool. Pierre Charles LeSueur, my truest name and my biggest lie. To believe I had virtue? To judge myself better than her? Oh, my sweet Winona, I am sorry. You should save your confession for the priest at the top of this bloody mountain, Barrow said. We're no better than you. Will you forgive me my other sins? Will you forgive my great lie? Yes, that's what I'll do, LeSueur said aloud. The Lord has brought me to my knees, and now I will make my confession right outside of his window, where he is certain to hear me. LeSueur rose, followed by the other two. If you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, though. Absolutely, Farrow said. Could I bother the two of you to place a hand on my shoulder while I piss off the edge? I can't hold it any longer, and I wouldn't feel right pissing upon a church, even if it is a mountain. Everyone would see the puddle upon the descent. As long as I don't have to look at it, Farrow laughed. I'd insist you look away, LeSueur said, and with the support of his friends, he stood, swaying yet restrained, with his toes to the ledge. Soon a burden was released over the edge of the cliff, and in a short time another burden would be released when he confessed another sin to the priest at the top of the mountain. Chapter 88, Abuna Yamada Gu, Abyssinia, 1709. It is smaller than I expected, Louis Armand Guerin thought. Although the mountain towered above the valley below, now that they reached the top of the climb, the actual church seemed small and modest, if you don't look down. Like fingers reaching for heaven, the mountain divided into separate spires, turrets of a castle, where a small bridge connected the platform of their ascent to the spire that held the church. On the other side of the natural bridge, a monk stood, and another looked out of a reinforced window. To the side, an open path led to the main door of the church, where a third priest stood grinning. What a strange journey we've shared, Guerin said. Are you ready to see what's on the other side of those walls? Josiah Farrow and Benjamin Horn both nodded. The five gathered around LeSueur also nodded in affirmation. As had been the case for the past few hours, they vulnerably crossed the final stretch. No castle in Europe was as defensible as Abuna Yamada Gu. First, it had a full view of miles upon miles of valley floor, which gave it the advantage of time. Even if a conqueror knew the path to take, which seemed impossible to the untrained, a hurried ascent took hours to make. A shower of gravel or unleashed arrows could defeat any army. Now facing the church itself, a single monk could defend it from the window facing the narrow bridge. Yet they were greeted with smiles and quickly brought into the sandstone opening. Horn translated as the norm, but after weeks in Abyssinia, Guerin knew enough phrases to understand what the priest spoke of, that the priest spoke of an omen. While the exterior of the church appeared to be tiny, the interior opened to a surprisingly large space comprising three areas. First, they greeted the priests was a small area for music, typical of churches in the area. Then they were led into a larger area where 80 worshipers from the area could crowd every Sunday. Here, the priest explained the sign. The murals on the wall rivaled anything from Constantinople or Rome, and the conditions of the cave had kept them preserved for the past 14 centuries. 9 saints, the priest said, tucking in a thumb as he stared at his 9 guests and then the ceiling and walls. When the church was founded, 9 saints, including Father Yamada, had come to this mountain to establish a church where there had already been a sanctuary. While Garin marveled at the ornate art, Horn and the priest discussed the significance of 9 guests coming to a place where 9 saints built a church. But when the words Washatakula were mentioned, Garin's head snapped back to the priest. Washatakula, he confirmed. According to the Periphery legend, the great she-wolf of Rome had actually suckled 9 pups, which were represented by the 9 levels of the subterranean headquarters, where 9 different types of agents were trained for service in the world. As one of their trained secret agents, Louis Armand Garin went out into the world as a sheep in wolf's clothing decades earlier. Yet the priest standing in front of him knew well the symbolism of the Periphery. Through Horn, their story and purpose were shared, and when the request was made, the priest took it in stride, unflinchingly, which led to prayer. For the quiet hour of music and meditation, Garin indeed praised the Lord, letting his weary legs rest in one of the most glorious places on earth. When the worship service ended, the priest sat with the visitors for a few minutes. After King Lalibela rescued it from Jerusalem and finished creating the 11 churches, he ordered it to be sent to this lonely mountain. We have simply been its caretakers. After your purpose is fulfilled, hide it far away from the world, where it can do no harm. Then he rose and walked to the third part of the church, the holiest of holies. A thick curtain partitioned this area from the place of worship, based on the original concept of the first temple in Jerusalem. As had been the case in Aksum, Lalibela, and even the small village churches, an Ark of the Covenant rested behind the curtain. In the days of Moses until the reign of King David, the real Ark had been kept in a tent. During the reign of King Solomon, the chest that held the 10 Commandments was brought into the stone temple, where it rested for the better part of 4 centuries, until the day it vanished from history. When the priests returned from the holiest of holies, he carried something wrapped in a wrapped box. Upon removing the outer covering, a small lead box appeared. Once the lid was removed, a small ring rested within, the seal of Solomon. Instead of gold, it was dark, an amalgamation of brass and iron. Upon its face, it bore strange etchings instead of holding jewels. Do not wear this until it is needed, the priest explained, for no man is righteous enough to bear it without risk of corruption. We will use it wisely, Garin said in Amharic. The priest and the men with him rose, leaving Garin squatting on the floor with the ring. Placing one hand on the stone floor, he rose and walked over to Lasur. I can think of no other who could bear the weight of this burden, for if you were worthy to hold the Alchemist's stone, you are worthy to be the keeper of the ring. No, Lasur said, stealing the smiles away from the others. No, Garin recoiled. We've come too far for him to ruin this now. Keep it, for I must first make confession to this priest. Now go. Wait outside. So Garin kept the ring in its lead box, carrying it with him as they walked out the small doorway onto the final deck and across the bridge to the other spire to wait for Lasur. Chapter 89, Abuna Yamada Gu, Abyssinia. Unable to converse with the foreign giant, Father Tabaki held up his finger to halt the frenzied words coming from the man. He poured his visitor a small cup of tea, which got the big ogre to stop talking for just a few minutes. While the visitor sipped his tea, Father Tabaki did his best to relate an important message for the man the others told him would be the ring bearer. I came here to serve after my wife died, Father Tabaki began. My family lives in the area, and I'd visited here many times in my youth. So it seemed like an obvious place for me to confront my grief while also serving. I didn't eat properly in those days, and once, when I rose, I stumbled and fell. My hand reached out to keep myself from falling, and I touched the ark. He pantomimed himself tipping over with his forearm. Then he showed the palm of his hand to the giant. I should have died. The ancient texts describe another fool who stumbled, touched the ark, and fell down dead. I then realized two things. God either spared me for a greater purpose, or it was only a replica of the real Ark of the Covenant. Father Tabaki put a finger to the ring bearer's chest. You must find our missing ark. I don't know if the stolen ark is the real one or another replica, but whatever the truth, it needs to be brought back home. He lifted his finger to point at the curtain and the hidden ark. Bring it back. The giant nodded in understanding and then proceeded to babble incoherent phrases, ending with him bowing low enough that his head was inches from Tabaki's feet. He touched the man's head to calm his penance. When the giant rose, he had grit teeth and had tears in his eyes, an attempt to assuage his guilt. After pursing his lips for several seconds, his eyes grew wide. He shuffled to the edge of the room and picked up a loose stone, which he set between them. The giant pointed to himself. Then he pointed to the stone. Then he began moving his hands through invisible dirt, separating it until he reached the stone. Then he took hold of the stone. When he took hold of the stone, his arms shook dramatically and even covered his hot eyes with his other hand. Then he turned over his palm to show the stone. He pointed to his friends, who waited across the narrow passage. Then he gestured a throw to the other window, as if tossing the stone into the valley below. Shaking his head, he revealed he still held the stone. The giant then pointed directly at him and said, Winona. He extended the stone to him. Just as he was about to grab it, the giant pulled it away, shaking his head. Then he pondered, closing his eyes and holding the stone to his forehead as he thought. The giant stood and looked out the window to where his friends stood. Pointing to them, he shook his head. Then he walked over to Father Dilladilly, who greeted arriving pilgrims outside the church doorway. The giant cleared his throat and then handed him the innocuous stone before returning to his spot in front of Father Tabaki. He resumed his lowly bow. Once again, he placed his hand on the giant's head. It seems as if you are filled with doubt and regret, and while I do not understand your confession, it seems contrite and worthy of forgiveness. You have traveled the world to visit me, and we do not understand each other at all, but we know why we have come. Come, let me share a secret with you. Father Tabaki took the giant by the hands and pulled him back to his feet, leading him to a window. Somewhere far out in the distance is Aksum, where another sacred treasure was kept for generations. When the time came, my countryman, a man named Balthasar, took this sacred treasure on a great journey very similar to yours. On this journey, he met other men just like your friends outside. Some were gruff, some were mighty warriors, and some were wise. They all came together and trusted that the Lord would guide them to the right place at the right time. Taking the ogre by the arm, he led him to the inner room, stopping short of the thick curtain that separated the room. Instead of showing the man the ark, he turned to show him one of the many paintings created centuries ago. 3 men stood together, each holding a chest. "That is my countryman, Balthazar," he said, pointing to the man on the right. "The other is Gaspar, a foreign king from the east. The third man came from the north." Father Tabaki pointed to the height. "And the dark beard? His name is Wutak." "Wutak," the giant repeated and then pointed. "Wutak?" Father Tabaki nodded and put a finger in the giant's chest. "Wutak." He pulled the giant out of the inner chamber and back out onto the main floor. There he found a picture showing Mary and the infant Jesus. It is said that all 3 laid their gifts before the Christ child, but when Wutak presented his, the child reached out a hand and touched him. The giant squeezed his eyes tight, as if struggling with concepts. He shook his head. "Your blood is special. 17 centuries ago, Wutak the Northman served another prophecy, but only because it was his duty as a blood heir." Father Tabaki took hold of the giant's 2 hands. One hand was touched by the Christ, but the other hand brought evil into the world. You were able to hold the sacred stone because you are an heir of Zictininya. "Zictininya?" the giant repeated, referencing his left hand. Father Tabaki closed both hands together to unite their hands together in the bond of prayer. "I will pray for you as you finish this terrible journey, for you have the capacity to serve good and also unleash evil. May you choose the right path." Chapter 90, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1709. The city of Philadelphia witnessed 4 significant population shifts in the 1600s. Originally home of the Lenape people, known later as the Delaware, the settlement was devastated by smallpox, leaving the river valley and port open for settlement. Fort Christina was built by Swedish settlers in 1638, but Dutch settlers quickly moved into the river valley. By 1655, Dutch General Peter Stuyvesant claimed the colony, but yet allowed Scandinavian colonists to remain in the area, in what is known now as New Sweden. By 1682, England had taken claim of the colony and renamed the settlement Philadelphia, the Greek phrase meaning the city of brotherly love. Under an elm tree, William Penn made a pact with the surviving Lenape, Scandinavians, and Dutch. The new English settlement would be a place of religious tolerance where anyone could worship freely. By the time the global War of Spanish Succession broke out, known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War, Philadelphia had become home to Germans, Scot-Irish, Scots, and French settlers, along with the minority Christian groups such as the Huguenots, Puritans, Calvinists, Mennonites, and Catholics. With Queen Anne's War waging most fiercely in the south along the Gulf of Mexico, and in the north in Acadia and Newfoundland, Philadelphia suffered financially when trade was mostly cut off to the English colony. Unbeknownst to Queen Anne, 3 ships of refugees, mostly children, arrived in 1706. The new colonists built a large school for the orphans that was open to the diverse melting pot population of Philadelphia. Its headmaster, a vibrant man of Portuguese descent, found himself embraced by the community due to his philanthropic nature. Yet, headmaster Dennis Falcoa had his secrets. Today, instead of supervising the students and teachers at Jacob's Well Preparatory School, headmaster Falcoa put on his jacket and went down to the docks where 3 ships prepared to depart. The two merchant ships, renamed Adam and Eve instead of Leaf and Leaf Racer, hadn't left port due to the frequent military patrols. The warship, now named Jonathan, had been stripped of most of its provisions, especially the cannons. Its captain and first mate stood upon the dock. "So it's true," Falcoa called out to them. "You're leaving Philadelphia?" Robert Culliford smiled upon recognition. "Likely for good. After returning these 3 ships to the Bahamas, Swan and I plan to withdraw to a quiet little island and retire. I've had enough of piracy for a lifetime. Swan and I have enough money hidden away to live 4 lifetimes, and after our dedicated service to Eos, we intend to live a simple life now." Culliford and Swan protected the children during the crossing from Madagascar, and after remaining to safeguard them for the past 3 years, they were leaving. The Bahamas? Edward Drummond is gathering pirates there, and Eos has need of ships. Patrick Dalziel is there, and Joseph Lemoyne, and his younger brother too. "Why not defend Acadia?" Falcoa asked. "There's nothing of value in the Caribbean." "Acadia will fall. If Eos fights too hard to keep it, the Priory will believe there's something worth fighting for. They'll never find the vault. In a few years, your students can discreetly deal with it." "It's probably a good thing for the school that you're leaving. I talked to a local merchant who thinks there is pirate treasure buried up the river from the school." "In Philadelphia?" Culliford scoffed. Even John Swan rolled his eyes. "The only thing of value in Philadelphia are the children." Falcoa shrugged. "I know. If you've received correspondence from Drummond, surely you know how the extraction of the relics went." "All I know is that it went well. Some treasures were left within the mountain, but the most important treasures have been secured. Men like you and I will never learn the exact details. From the ashes of the phoenix, Eos rises again. To think, in just 3 years, Eos has taken root again. Montreal has survived another war, and the fledgling colony in Louisiana has grown feathers. And now the Bahamas." "Pay attention to what you read about the Caribbean," Culliford said dismissively. "It is only subterfuge to distract the Priory of Ormus and our other enemies. Ormus will poke around the corpse of Madagascar and then turn its attention to the epidemic of piracy. This place. This is where all the stolen funds will be directed. The dreams of Thomas II will flourish here. Within a generation, the Free States will be reborn. Teach these children well, Headmaster Falcoa." Falcoa extended a hand, but Culliford pulled him in for a warm embrace. Never gregarious, John Swan crossed his arms. "I wish both of you a healthy retirement," Falcoa said before turning to his school. As he strolled back up the streets, he smiled, knowing that James Morrison would eventually have his revenge. Chapter 91, The Dalek Islands, 1709. Giovanni Naufragio's command of the White Zombie came to an end with a smile. As a young man, he'd spent enough time in the rigging to suit him, but today he had no problem climbing up the mast of the crow's nest for a better view. Putting the looking glass to his eye, he saw 3 mostly full skiffs crossing the Red Sea Channel. Charlie's hulking frame and the crew's mixed ethnicity made their identities fairly obvious. They survived the journey. He let out 3 shrill whistles. Farther away from the ship, in the makeshift camp, dozens of men rose from their shade to face the ship. Naufragio let out 3 shrill whistles again. Men began to run. His crew of carpenters ran to the port side of the White Zombie for a look. Compared to the long, challenging stay on Tortuga, Naufragio had barely fallen into a new routine. Most of the Caribbean crew stayed on the island with Del Toro in charge, and he kept men to maintain the ship and steadily improve it. If the captain wants to lift anchor tonight, the White Zombie will be ready. That night, though, the men feasted on fresh food after stuffing the ship for the next journey. The officers gathered together around the central fire to share tales. Things had gone well, Naufragio learned, much more exciting than staying on the lonely island. As Garen and Duke told tales of Aksum, Lalabella, Yemrahena, and Abuna Yamatagu, Naufragio couldn't help but notice a harrowing expression on Charlie's face. What happened to him? Finally, the journey ended with Garen's grin. "Show the others the ring, Charlie." LeSueur produced a small lead box, and taking the gold ring into his fingertips, he showed it for all the men. "We all witnessed what happened to Charlie back on Madagascar," Garen said. "It seems as if Papa Bones was right about him having Cho-Job. In the spirit of Odysseus, let me be clear. No one is to even breathe on that ring except for Charlie. It's powerful but dangerous." For many, it was their second decade with Garen. For most, they knew the mission was special. Tomorrow, we'll lift anchor and begin our long journey west, with Professor Pharaoh's command of the ancient language, Charlie wearing the ring, and a canister of Shamir to unlock. We'll rob the Eos vault, and then begin to set things right.